One.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for a presentation on the Edelman Trust Barometer and its policy implications, our 22nd year of tracking trust in our institutions, government, NGOs, business, and media. Our CEO, Richard Edelman, was inspired to launch this initiative, which has become a hallmark of our firm when anti-trade activists stormed the World Trade Organization meetings in Seattle in 1999. I was there at the time. Previously, I'd been a negotiator for China's accession to the WTO. And for us trade wonks, it was a wake-up call about the sometimes unequal benefits that global trade brings to our economy and to the lives of our communities. It reflected the different perspectives our community have about the institutions tasked with us, providing us with the necessary information and framework to live a better life. Our Trust Barometer has tracked these trends now for 22 years, and this year looked at 28 countries. And as you will hear, the results, especially for developed country democracies, are quite stark. Richard Edelman, the brains and spirit behind the trust, will provide us with an overview of the findings for this year and his conclusions. And then we have distinguished members of our International Advisory Board, politicians, ministers, ambassadors, from different regions and institutions to share their insights about what this means for policymakers. Now, Richard, over to you. Richard, unfortunately, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, everybody. Okay, so this is the 21st Edelman Trust Barometer. We started this after the battle in Seattle in '99 when people were protesting globalization. This is actually, if you sort of look at this over a period of time, you'll see that the first phase was NGOs as the most trusted institution for 19 years. And then for the first time, government became the most trusted institution during the height of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. And then last year in January, business emerged as the most trusted institution, a little bit last man standing. And then in this year's study, you'll see, in fact, that business again is the most trusted institution. But we also want to identify a vicious cycle of distrust between government and media in a death grip. So we'll go further. Next slide. So business again is the only institution over 60, which is what we judge to be the most, the sort of trust line. NGOs close behind, government quite behind, and media the least trusted, media like an airplane running out of gas. But it's important that you recognize that this is 28 countries as an average. I'm going to make the case that, in fact, we're in a deep problem with democracy. Next slide. Government and media are seen as deeply divisive by our 35,000 respondents. By contrast, business and NGOs are seen as unifying forces in society. This is a new phenomenon. It is a next level of problem for government. Next, please. In the media business, the news sources are failing to fix the trust issue. And what I want you to see is, while the averages are important, the specific country data is deeply important. Specifically, social media in Western Europe is utterly unacceptable as a source of information. We also find that traditional media in markets such as the US, Korea, and Japan is deeply troubled. The why? Chasing clicks, not pursuing their classic job of authority. Next, please. And also fake news. People basically don't feel as if they can get high quality information, that news is fact being used as a weapon. And the jumps in some of these markets are significant, Germany, et cetera. It plays into the broader theme of distrust in institutions. Next, please. There is a deep desire for government to succeed in issues that really matter: sustainability, diversity and race, wage levels, reskilling. We want government to succeed, but which institution is best able to solve these problems? It's business. And who's the least? Government. Why? Because government's unable to coordinate across institutions, and most importantly, government is not seen as getting results. Next, please. Societal fears are on the rise, just as we see institutional inability. So specifically, 85% of respondents are afraid of losing their job. It's either to automation or because of the pandemic. Climate change is rising as a concern, cyber attacks, loss of freedom, and last, prejudice and racism, higher in the US than other markets. Next. Our thesis is that we now have a death machine constructed between government and media. That in fact, yesterday in Axios, there was a piece about how AOC and Ted Cruz, when there's an article about them, it gets exploded in social. So the more you move to the extreme, the more heat you get from media. And so the connection between division and disinformation leads to societal instability. Meanwhile, you have business and NGOs trying to be the balancing force. It's like a table with 4 legs and only 2 are high and 2 are low. So the table is slanted. Next. We have a real problem with our classic societal leaders. Government, leaders, journalists, and CEOs are at the bottom. Who's at the top? Scientists, co-workers, and my CEO. What does it mean? Trust is local. Trust is close to us. Close is in the mayor, it's not in the head of state. Next, please. This is a shocker. 2/3 literally believe we're being lied to by our leaders, whether it's journalists, government leaders, or business leaders, purposely trying to mislead us. So not only do we have problems with the channels, we have problems with the leaders. Next, please. We have a record trust gap between the so-called elites, top 25% of income, and the bottom 25%. This used to be a problem only in the US, UK, and France. You saw what happened with Trump, Macron, Brexit. Now it's transversal. Look on the right side. The greatest gaps are in markets that we never saw this before. Saudi, UK, that's before. Ireland, Germany, Netherlands, Thailand, 36 points. That will lead to electoral instability because a mass class divide led by increasing asset prices. In fact, the last 2 years have been great for the wealthy, stock markets, real estate, et cetera, and the lower income between job loss and fear of disease and bad outcomes in COVID. Next. The political chasm in the United States is shocking. And the statistics in this, most interesting is the decline of trust of Republicans in business. You see that, in fact, for the first time, Ds are more trusting in business than Rs. 12-point drop by Republicans because they think that business is too woke. Similarly, key point, look how low trust is among Republicans, both in government and in the media. Big decline. Why is the US sitting at the bottom of the global rank among countries? It's because of Republicans now. They don't trust their institutions. Next. This is the money slide. Distrust is the default of our respondents. 60% say, I distrust until I see evidence. And 2/3 say, I can't have a civil debate any longer. We're in a dystopic world. Next. Here's the data of the 28 countries that we follow. The important thing to note is that China has moved to the most trusted by its own population. At the bottom, historically, Russia and Japan, but the United States is just above the bottom. The US has dropped 10 points since 2017. It was a high middle. It is now a low bottom. And that was a W. Bush line, low bottom. Okay, next, please. There are big questions about today's capitalism. Half the people in this world don't think that it serves their purpose. Capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. 1/3 of people believe that centrally managed economies do a better job than free market in the democracies. So the bottom part of the population is irritated, pissed off, whatever else you want to say. The system isn't working for them. Next. Societal leadership is now a core function for business. Why? Because last man or woman standing. Next. The stakeholder group, from consumers to employees to investors, are all holding business accountable. Look at the numbers. Almost 2/3 of people choose a place to work based on values. Almost 2/3 of people buy brands based on whether they stand up on issues. 88% of global investors put ESG at the same level as operations and financial results in buying shares. Next. My employer is trusted all over the world. Trust is local. Remember, my employer 17 points higher than business and 25 points higher than government. That's why there's big pressure on CEOs to speak up on the issues of the day. Next. Stunningly, my employer media, my company newsletter is the most believable source of information, whether about vaccination, education, or any other issue. Trailing is government, media, and advertising. Next. CEOs, the orders from the respondents: speak up on policy, inform the debate, shape the conversation, but stay out of politics. Now, this is a fine art that our panel will tell you how to do, but it is a tightrope. You tell me how you are going to, do this in a city like Minneapolis, which has policing issues, without getting into politics. So that's what they want, policy, not politics. Next. This chart is one that you should put up on your cube or in your home office. Government is literally 53 points less competent than business. That's why there's so much dependence on business to get things done. NGOs are the most ethical, not quite as competent, but you have a very unbalanced world. You can see this as like a seesaw on the playground where one kid's on the bottom, the other's on the top, and they're not going back and forth. It's just stuck. Next. People want more, not less, business engagement on societal issues. This, we thought, was the year where we had reached the limit of business involvement in these issues. Not so. 5-1 on climate, economic inequality, reskilling, etc. So in short, more, not less. The art is how. Next. This slide amazed us. We thought this would be true simply for media, but it is information quality is the most important, powerful trust builder across every institution, from business to NGO to government. So what it means is media in its winnowed form, in its politicized form, in its chasing clicks form isn't going to do it. Every other institution has to be part of putting good information in front of people. Next. Finally, we believe that trust can be restored to the system, but each institution has to do its part to get to societal stability. The societal role of business is here to stay. We have to have tangible progress on issues, in particular that the system works, reskilling being number one among those. Third, I give business credit, particularly on sustainability, for focusing on long-term. That is not true of the other institutions. Too short-term. We've got to have solutions over divisiveness. Last, every institution has to be part of giving trustworthy information. So Deborah, in my inability to hear anything, I'm practicing for my elderly years, I guess. I will pass the baton to you and the great panel. Thanks all of you. And in a future state, I will be able to communicate.
Thanks, Richard. We'll overcome those technological challenges, but we've now set the stage with our overview. I just want to tell our audience, if you do have questions, let's use the Q&A capability there. Now, we are also familiar with Zoom. You'll know how to do that. I'm going to start now with members of our Global Advisory Board to tease out some of these concepts. And let's start with Michael Nutter, former mayor of Philadelphia and a leading thinker about many of the urban and domestic issues that we are facing here in the US. So in our finding, in the United States, trust in our institutions across the board has dropped. Why do you think the American people have lost confidence? And is this a change that you've noticed in your own city of Philadelphia?
Deborah, thank you. And Richard, thanks for the walking us through the trust survey. First, I think these issues have been going on for a while. There's no question about it. For some time, the American public has been, how would I say, at odds with ourselves, and we seem to exist in almost a daily schizophrenia of how we interact, what we do, and how we do it. Secondly, the 24/7, 365, 366 news cycle, the need to put on something, everything, almost anything that either does make sense or doesn't make sense in the media, I think is driving a lot of this. And then, of course, sadly, the pandemic has revealed every deficiency, every fault line in virtually every institution that exists, including the media. I think we cannot, and government. I was in office during the Great Recession, which we thought was the worst thing since the Great Depression. But now we have this, which is an entirely different kind of situation. But I think for me, Deborah, I tell young people all the time, 2020 for you all will be 1968 for the rest of us. In 2020, we had a pandemic, civil unrest, deficits, and a presidential election, any one of which would have been, unusual in 1 year. All four of those things happened. And so what people are saying about government and the media, going back to the administration before the Biden administration, the term alternative facts, which was certainly a new one for me. I didn't know there could be alternative facts, but nonetheless, the demonization of the media, the chastising and credibility gap on the media side. And so now you can get news, you can get your own news. You can find a news source that you agree with 99% of the time, virtually anywhere. And so as we all retreat literally and figuratively into our own bubbles, you just keep hearing and listening and talking about the same things amongst yourselves and your friends, and that becomes the fact. That becomes the truth. And we do see it at the local level, certainly as well, but nowhere near, I think, as bad as the national level. The one last thing I want to say is similar to, what Richard pointed out was the difference between CEOs in general versus my CEO. We would see the same at the local level, whether it's, Congress is, horrible, but my congressman is great. Most of the politicians are bad, but my city councilman or my mayor, is doing the right thing or telling us the truth. And I think ultimately it comes down to what's happening on the ground, wherever you are, and how those messages and messengers communicate.
Great. And let's take a look at those differences between Republicans and Democrats, because those were really stark, particularly those numbers around business, where you see for the Democrats actually confidence in business going up, while a significant drop for Republicans in their confidence in all institutions, but particularly in business. And they're supposed to be usually, the pro-business party. What do you attribute that to? Is this a difference in our expectations and the role that business plays in society?
Well, again, I think the breaking point for a lot of folks was probably 2020, the rise of not only civil awareness, but racial reckoning, the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, the number of companies, CEOs, and a variety of others who then started speaking out. We go look at Charlottesville and the tragedy there. More and more companies were hearing their own constituents, if you will. They're not, CEOs are not necessarily elected, but they do pay attention to a constituency. And they were hearing their own employees. They were hearing their customers and what they were saying, and decided, I want to be on the right side of this particular issue. I want to be on the right side of history, which I think in many instances probably turned off a significant number of Republicans because, CEOs, elected or not, they understand they have a constituency.
That's very helpful. So let's now start to look at some of the numbers from the rest of the world. And we have Ambassador Elnaggar, who is joining us. The ambassador has served in several senior diplomatic posts at the United Nations, at the Arab League, and in the United States on behalf of Egypt. He was the Deputy Minister of Investment, as well as running Egypt's largest state-owned enterprise. So, Mr. Ambassador, in the countries surveyed, we see that trust by citizens is falling in governments and rising confidence in business. Yet in the Middle East, we didn't see this trend. Actually, trust rose in both institutions, particularly in governments, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia showing going from about in the 60s up into the 70s. What do you see is different in this trend? Why are we seeing that versus what's happening in the United States and some of the Western democracies?
Well, thank you very much. And I would like also to thank Richard for the presentation. Look, I mean, the two countries that are surveyed are both UAE and Saudi Arabia, so it's not like the wider MENA region. But why the feedback from both countries are a bit different from the from the democracies, basically, it's because there are two things that work really. During the pandemic years and onward, one, it's the resources in both countries, which are immense. Number two, the population. Okay, so when you look at UAE and you look at basically, one of the criteria that Richard spoke about and is in the presentation is the income-based trust inequality. And you see in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is 40 million people, there is income inequality, okay? But in UAE, most of the population, which is much, much, much less, okay, is basically, if you want to label them, middle class or upper middle class and higher up in terms of income. So you'll understand why the UAE is scoring much better in that. Number two, you see both countries effectively using the resources to support their population basically in terms of subsidies, in terms of wages during the 2020. So they didn't leave it, actually. They forced the private sector to come in and actually provide those wages and actually subsidize those wages. So yes, there is enough trust in both countries. But when you look at the Saudi example and you see the income-based trust level, that's it gives you also an indication. Media there, although they're both active on social media with variations, but media is still manipulated. Basically, local media is still manipulated, and you can see that across the region.
Well, yeah, and I imagine that then obviously has an impact on the quality, right, information quality that is going out, because it's not as divisive as we see maybe in the United States with the use of social media by differing parties.
Yes, but you can see that in bigger countries like Egypt, where social media, and Egypt, I think, is the #1 per capita country in terms of Facebook membership. So you see that the divisiveness, but on very soft issues, you don't see it on the real issues. But because, again, the parental government, dictates and maneuvers in terms of policies, in terms of these things. So still the role of government is much bigger than the role of business in the MENA region at large. You can also see that on how effective some countries were in terms of dealing with the pandemic, with dealing with the vaccination process, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, even, Morocco, largest countries in terms of per capita, in terms of vaccination for their population from the beginning. So the government there is still the biggest player on all facets of life.
So, and one of the other key findings too was this new role for business in speaking out on these societal issues. And the MENA region is going to be host of the next 2 COPs. And while we didn't survey Egypt, we did only look at the UAE, which will be the host for COP28, and Saudi Arabia. Do you see these expectations that business also in the region continue to speak out, particularly on issues like climate change, or there isn't that same need given this confidence and trust in government?
Well, you know what? It's going to be inevitable at one point or the other. It depends on the issue. So if we're talking about job creation or job loss, if you're talking about wages, if you're talking about things like that, although the government has the upper hand and the stronger hand, there is, again, an interest from the businesses to actually participate in that, but not necessarily in terms of effectively dictating policy or influencing policy. But again, they will have a way of doing that. Just also for the MENA region, and I mean, this study is quite interesting, and there are a number of things that could be debated, in this study. But in the MENA region, the variations between countries, you cannot really draw the line between them and the sort of well-established democracies or the well-established free market economies. There are different roles that the government does face-to-face or from behind the scenes. So, and the media, with the exception of social media, is not the free media that Western countries or Western societies or democracies are, sort of used to. But again, social media is key, however, very divisive, a very big source of misinformation. There is a growing mistrust actually in the MENA region of those sources. especially when the pandemic hit. The 2020 to 2022 years are, had a huge impact on social media.
Well, I think that was really a very important point that you make about the media. And certainly as we look across some of the countries surveyed, one of the areas that we are not discussing on the panel today is China, but certainly the media in China has a very different role than it does in the United States. And so the numbers are turning out, as you point out, to be very different, particularly in those countries where the media tends to be more influenced by the government. Let's now turn to Latin America, and we're fortunate to have Ambassador Carolina Barco with us. She's the former Foreign Minister of Colombia, Ambassador to the United States, most recently Ambassador to Spain, but she's also a global leader on urban sustainability. So Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, they have the highest percentage point difference between trust in business and government in 2022. Each of these countries ranks business as a more trustworthy institution than government by roughly 30 percentage points. What is causing this?
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for this opportunity and Richard for this incredible study. What I'm finding is that what was picked up by the Edelman Trust Barometer is something that has been picked up during the last 25 years by Latino Barometro, which has been looking for all Latin American 18 countries. So it's not only the ones that were surveyed right now, that trust in democracy and in government has been decreasing 11 points in the last 20 years. And why? Because governments are seen to be ineffective, not addressing the issues of low-income groups. And there's a growing dissatisfaction and disaffection. So we find that this is sort of almost throughout the whole region. Business, on the contrary, is seen as being much more successful, getting things done, and therefore trust has been sort of growing more towards business and less towards government. We also find that the IDB, the private sector part of the IDB Invest, did a study that just came out 2 weeks ago about trust, and it was called Trust, the Key to Social Cohesion and Growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, because once again, we find that throughout the whole region, the trust levels have gone down tremendously in others. And in fact, it is the region that has the lowest trust level for others as general, not for my CEO or the local. And this has been exacerbated, although there was some growth and belief in the governments when they first started carrying out the policies for the pandemic, because the pandemic has had such a hard result in our economies because they are based on informality and job loss and poverty have increased to levels that we had 12 years ago and absolute poverty levels to what we had 20 years ago. So this is making it even more difficult for governments and placing sort of a greater responsibility on business. And we see that business has come out during the pandemic to offer opportunities, and it tried to work ways to get people to be able to get to work, not to lay them out, to provide services. And I think that as we go forward, and as the IDB study shows, businesses will be asked to pick up more of working with government and themselves working to address these issues of income inequality and lack of services or equal services for all, and opportunity, which is basically what's at the base of all this distrust and dissatisfaction.
So it's so interesting with this rise in poverty and this lack of trust in government. Still 60% of respondents in sort of Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico are optimistic about the future. And these numbers really contrast with the United States and some of the other developed economies who essentially are not. Is this reflective of where they see the economy going and hope in future leadership, or what do you believe is behind this trend of happiness or optimism, maybe is a better way?
Optimism, and it is very interesting when we look at Latin America. and there's that happiness index. Latin America, up till very recently, came out very high in the happiness index, even though there were so many problems. So there clearly is sort of a resilience and sort of an innate optimism that I think comes through. We're also in a very interesting moment right now in Latin America, and all these conclusions that Richard was talking about, the importance that hopefully we will have good information that will be able to work together, that governments can pull together. We're at a moment that's very interesting because as a result of the social protests, which came in 2019, which was right before the pandemic, and the pandemic made a lot of the reasons for the social protests, which was loss, the youth and diverse groups felt that there was no opportunity and didn't feel that government was responding to them. As a result, the elections in the last 2 years we've come with new governments, a very sort of fragmented politics, the presence of many more independents, of a more diverse group, and a change sort of to the left, but not the extreme left like Venezuela or Nicaragua, but one where there is a dialogue, there are alliances being made, and they're making fundamental changes. Chile is addressing the issue of a new constitution. Colombia started a whole dialogue with the youth in the regions. Youth is asking for more education, is asking for more opportunities. So I think there's also, we may be picking up some of this hope that this change can take place, because clearly we're having a participation of citizens who are not so involved. In the Boric election, it was youth and it was women who made a big difference in his election. So people are coming out to talk. So I think maybe belief that maybe this change can happen may be part of this hope. And we'll just have to follow it, because the economic numbers, as we were saying, are not good. And we have high inflation, and we need to work on better productivity. The problems are there, but there seems to be this hope, and I think that gives business and government a greater responsibility to respond and see how we can move out of this cycle of distrust.
And it does seem too that inclusiveness also helps to build some level of trust. And so that's, I think, a very, very strong message that's consistent with some of the findings that we have coming out of the study. And now,
and there's just an example. Business has played a role in Latin America, and the business associations. We have wonderful examples of private partnerships that have made a difference. Medellin, when it was going through its worst period, survived because the private sector stayed there. The private sector worked with the public sector. They had long-term visions and they had specific projects. So I think we have also examples from which the private sector can build on, and that will serve across board.
That's terrific. Thank you, Carolina. And now let's turn to Ambassador Irina Bokova. She was most recently the Director General of UNESCO. She started her career in the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry, rising to Foreign Minister. She was elected twice as Member of Parliament and served as the government's first Secretary of European Integration. So, Ambassador, in most Western and developed country democracies, as we've seen, trust has collapsed in the government and media, and it's viewed as feeding a very vicious cycle of mistrust, fueling these rising fears and societal issues, as Richard pointed out, around job loss, climate change, cyber attacks. You work with governments around the world. How are you seeing this rise of distrust play out? Are you seeing that consistently around, or do you find in some of the more, as Ambassador Elnaggar had pointed out, in some of the countries that have greater control over, say, the media, or where they have greater control, less of a democracy, that we're not seeing that same collapse in the governments that you're working with?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks to Richard for this very interesting presentation. Indeed, it's a hallmark report, and I think we have seen in the last years this erosion of trust in governments, in institutions, regional, national, global, I would say, because I did work a lot with United Nations through UNESCO. And I believe that this erosion of trust started with the financial crisis, with all the ideas of how to, all the different policies of how to overcome the increasing inequalities among the countries, and sometimes the inability of the political systems. I would not say just one political party, but of political systems to deal with these issues. And I was listening once again to Richard now after reviewing the report, and I think two issues come into the forefront. One is leadership, and I think leadership matters, and it's very important nowadays. And the other is the issue of values, because in the end of the day, trust is a civic capital. Trust is this civic capital which binds together certain values in a society, in a community, in order for them to stream this into an effort in order to achieve a public good, be it at the global level, in a societal level, or in a certain country. And I was not surprised to see that the rise of the private sector and the NGOs, because for the same reasons, the NGO community, and I have worked a lot and continue to work with the NGOs, which are a major partner for development in many parts of the world. NGO community has been led by values, by ethics. They're bridging the gaps in some of the development systems in countries. They're the ones that raise very high the bar of diversity, of anti-racism, of gender equality, of sustainability, of climate change. And I think this has to be recognized. And the other is because I do believe that the private sector, and I have seen this in the last 10 years, interacting with the private sector within the sustainability agenda within the United Nations. I'm speaking about climate, biodiversity, health, education. The private sector made a huge leap into not just embracing these ethics and these values, but also leading some of these policies. And I would say that they share the same values of civic capital, of looking at trust as a civic capital. So now the big question, of course, is how to rebuild it and how to use this capital, I would say, or a very positive dynamic of civil society, or NGOs, and the private sector. And I think here is I would say the opportunity once again to have a nexus, to have some kind of interface between the governments and these institutions on the basis of what we are speaking about, these same values that we want all of them to share.
Well, and thank you. And one of the areas that we haven't really touched much upon in the discussion, but is one of the other trusted institutions are NGOs. And you've created NGOs, you've run NGOs, you obviously ran UNESCO, which works with many NGOs. How can they help in building societal trust, rebuilding societal trust?
You know, I believe that NGOs are fundamental in many of the circumstances. And I don't say that we have discharged governments from their responsibility, not at all. And the fact that Richard mentioned, last year governments were up, or 2 years ago, now civil society goes up. I think there should be a kind of a very close partnership. And somebody said recently, and I totally embrace this, that leadership today, new leadership today is partnerships. And partnerships are critical in implementing some of these very important policies. NGOs not just simply have to be supported, they have to be listened to, and they have also to be part of some of the decision making, the process, the civic engagement. I think nowadays, particularly in the democracies, some people are just disenchanted because they think they're not listened to, and NGOs can make this happen once again. And on the other side, the private sector that embraced all the challenges nowadays. As I said, we haven't seen anything happening until now in terms of climate change, the commitment, what is the purpose of business involving also inequalities in diversity. They're solving all these problems on a daily basis. And partnerships, once again, are key if we want to move forward.
Exactly, because not one of these institutions can do it alone. And certainly as we have an expectation even for business to take on more roles, ultimately they are not the government. They can't make policy. They can't make laws. And so it's important. So I am going to ask all our panelists one question. I'm going to give you a moment to think about it because we're going to turn to one of our colleagues, Martin Reiser, who is just off Capitol Hill to get some of his perspective on the US. But I would like all of our panelists to think what one point in this surprised you the most or you found the most interesting in all of this. And while you think about that, Marty, just what's your reaction to, now you've read the report, how you see this divide in the United States, particularly Republicans and Democrats, and what does business need to look out for?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So, I'll start with something that actually did not surprise me in the study, which is the fact that Republicans distrust and don't want businesses speaking out on issues. And that is not a surprising finding to leaders of the Republican Party at this point. There's been a sea change transformation in the bases of both parties, and the Republican Party has come to represent a lower income, less educated group of Americans, and that process has accelerated even since the 2020 election. It began many years ago, but it is a process that is speeding up. And many of those people came to the Republican Party, ironically, because of feeling, as Richard talked about, fear of job security and falling behind. And a lot of the globalization efforts of the last 30 years left a lot of people behind. Those people have gravitated towards the Republican Party. So they by their very nature, trust business a little bit less than the traditional Republican voter of years past. The wokeness aspect of this does not help those numbers, so to speak. But I think, businesses clearly from the numbers that overall show that they are expected to speak out on issues. What I think is the tricky thing and the dividing line, businesses should speak out very strongly on the issues on which they have great deals of expertise, like fiscal policy per se, climate change, globalization, competition with China. Their voices are needed and respected, and whether agreed to or not, respected on both sides. Where it gets a little trickier is on issues that don't necessarily traditionally have an impact on their bottom lines or their businesses. Some of the more difficult cultural issues that we're facing and racial issues. That becomes an immediate dividing line because the two parties are so divided on those issues to begin with. And I think, one of the really frustrating pieces that comes out of this study, and Mayor Nutter talked about this, how people are going into their own circles and getting their own information, and it keeps getting reinforced. If you're a political leader and you're in trouble, and look, we are very divided evenly between Republicans and Democrats in Congress right now, and also, pretty evenly divided at the governor levels as well. When you're in trouble as a politician, you're going to go first talk to the people who support you. And so then you are reinforcing the people that don't trust you, those messages. And it's a vicious cycle. Republicans are talking to Republicans and they're getting great feedback. Democrats are talking to Democrats and they're getting great feedback, but they're dividing each other even more. So it's a complicated story, but we need to keep focusing on the facts and just, as best we can. So that's sort of my reaction.
Great. Thanks, Marty. Okay, Mayor Nutter, we'll start with you on most surprising or interesting fact.
unmute myself. Well, I want to thank Marty for taking away the thing that I was going to mention as the most surprising, which was the turning of Republicans to some extent against business. But I think that so now putting that one aside. Maybe not so much surprising, but certainly reinforcing the notion that at the local level, there is seemingly more trust of, whether it's my CEO or maybe my elected official or my member of Congress. And I am hopeful that through the work of obviously Richard and the entire Edelman team and certainly Edelman Global Advisors, that we're able to get this information out, as Marty talked about, to Democrats, to Republicans, to people unaffiliated, whatever the case may be, and that they would actually do something with this information and recognize that, just talking to your friends is not helping you. Just staying in your own little bubble is not going to help you advance, especially on the government side. And I guess my last thing is, wow, the media is really taking a brutal beating. I mean, I know I'm aging myself, maybe for some of the other people who are listening, but, I never worried about what Walter Cronkite was going to tell me. Right? I mean, there were 3 stations, ABC, NBC, CBS. You waited till 6:30 or so at night. A man came on, mostly men, right, and told you this is what happened today. And you will not hear from me for another 24 hours because apparently nothing else is going to happen in that 24 hours until I tell you what happened yesterday, tomorrow. So, it's so different. And I think all of us have to come to grips with this unfortunate, at times, new reality.
Yeah, well said, Mayor. Ambassador Elnaggar?
Yes. Okay. So maybe something that it's not surprising, but this point is basically where this report leads to, actually tackling all these issues and the trust level on different institutions who are working on this. This necessitates basically a new social contract, and which is something that I would like to mention. But there are 2 things that are surprising for me. Just putting myself here from that part of the world, sort of the more developing part of the world, more, with all its problems specific to it and all of these things. Number one, that the number 2 concern is climate change, which indicates a huge gap between, the countries that were surveyed and the others that were not surveyed, basically. Because, I come from a region where climate change is important and everything, but it's not high on the priority of anybody. Okay, job creation or jobs, or, even cyber attacks are more important than climate change. The other thing is basically whether it is a democracy or not a democracy, whether it is in this part of the world or that part of the world, media is very much under attack, and especially in social media. And I just want to reinforce the point that the mayor said about, we used to sit waiting for that news half an hour, which is government-led, okay, government operated, and it comes out and we believe everything, all right? Today, there's very limited trust. You need to go to a different source and a terrible source. And you can see in our part of the world, we usually work with on the WhatsApp social media type of thing. So you see all these fake things that come out and people are talking about, and there are very important issues actually at tech. So these are the points I want to make.
Great, thank you. That's, very interesting about the point on media too. So Ambassador Barco.
Yes, no, I think that I'm going to highlight exactly the question you asked me, because I was very surprised. And I think it is a call to action. And if we're talking about policy, It's a moment that we should, of reckoning of our democracies, our government, our partnerships. I agree with Ambassador Bokova that becomes fundamental. If 60% of people still think that in 5 years they're going to be better off, that's hopeful. And if you're a government or if you're in the private sector, you have to work on that. And hopefully we will look at the information we have and see how what was on that last slide, which I think was very, very interesting. We can be more effective, work in these partnerships, make long-term projects, decisions and short-term projects, and have good information. This becomes absolutely fundamental. So I was very, very impressed by this decision and heartened by the fact that there still is 60% belief that something can be done. And I think this is a call to action, and policymakers and leaders in our region should be looking at this and thinking about this.
Right. Yes. And that opportunity for optimism and inclusiveness. So Ambassador Bokova, the last word.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't say that I was so surprised, but I was very sad, very frustrated by the notion that politics is so divisive that in order to have the trust, you have to stay away from politics. And maybe this is also one of the reasons that the business and NGOs who are viewed as non-political have such a high trust. I always, because I come from this part of the world where we embrace the democratic changes, and we believe that still that politics matter, that democracy matters, and seeing this kind of a downward spiral where media is not trusted and governments are not trusted, and that people are not listening to each other. I think this is the other part of the big, I would say, challenge that we have now in front of not just democracies, I would say in any society, is the lack of dialogue, of civilized dialogue sometimes. And we have seen political leaders in international fora or domestically, they say things that otherwise some 20 years ago, it would have been impossible even to think about. So this lack of civilized dialogue is what really worries me, because how are you going to regain trust in institutions, in the political process, I would say, if you don't have really trust in this civilized dialogue. I mean, you may say that, oh, we have to educate our young people in civic engagement in order to make choices, critical thinking, which is true and is very important to do. But I think something bigger, a big malaise in societies exists from that point of view and has to be looked at.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on, the importance of civil discourse and our ability to engage with those that we have a different opinion with. And I think all of you touched upon that in your presentations, but how can these four institutions find ways to have a civil discourse, start to work together, look at those long-term partnerships that you've touched upon, and be much more inclusive, because fundamentally, that is where we need to also build up the trust with listening to differing points of views and creating quality information as we build towards helping our governments, right, in whichever part of the region we're in, help make good policy. And so I want to thank all of you for all your insights. Really appreciate it. And sorry, I think we did have some questions that came in at the last minute, but we're unfortunately at time. Really appreciate the audience joining us. Many thanks to all of you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.